and then let you know who you have for your delectation tonight. Oh, we started recording already. Fantastic. I was like, where's the record button? Oh, it's already happened. Fantastic. All perfectly planned, folks. Well, welcome tonight to this webinar in which we're going to be considering community engagement through Christian festivals, or I think we've also advertised it as through liturgical festivals. So in other words, the Christian year, the different festivals of the Christian year, how can we use those to engage with our community? So we've got Elizabeth Clark with us, our National Rural Officer, and she is she's told Holly and I about some festivals we'd never even heard of, which is fantastic. So Elizabeth's going to be telling us a bit more about that later on. Holly Adams is also here, our Evangelism and Contemporary Culture Officer. She'll be helping us think about the evangelistic edge of that, how we might share our faith through Christian festivals. And I'm Emma Nash, I'm the Mission and Community Engagement Officer. So I'll be thinking about the community engagement aspect, thinking about how we might reflect on how our communities celebrate and how we can join in with that. So it's great to have you all with us. As we said earlier, we're a relatively small group tonight. So when you will be welcome to unmute. You will be able to be a bit more informal than we usually would be in a webinar, which is great. We're really delighted that you're with us. Holly, you've got a poll for us, haven't you?
Yeah, I will launch the poll. So just thought as a bit of an icebreaker, a bit of a kind of get us started thinking about this stuff, we'd have a quick just a fun poll, and the question is, which of the following festivals celebrated by churches is your favourite for community outreach? So I'm launching that now, so that should appear on your screens. And some of these are kind of more traditionally Christian festivals than others. Some are celebrated in more churches than others. Some are celebrated in a very wide way. Others are less well known, but I just thought it'd be a fun way to kind of get us thinking about the liturgical festivals that we'll be talking about this evening and ways that we might reach our communities.
Are we talking about in our own specific communities or generally?
I'd say generally, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you've been doing community outreach through these festivals, but kind of what excites, which of these excite you most as an opportunity for community outreach?
Is it just one, or can we put several in?
That's a good question. I think you can just tick one. Has anyone ticked one and tried to tick a second one? I think it's just one answer. And then I will share the results in a minute with you.
Yeah, so someone's already asked what's Plough Sunday. Elizabeth, I'm guessing you'll tell us that later on, are you? Oh, you're muted, my friend.
Yep, I will be covering that later on, and rogation and lemmas and other things.
Okie dokie. I'm going to end polling and share the results now. So as you can see, the winner is Christmas, which I think may have been a bit predictable. Everyone loves doing outreach and evangelism at Christmas. I know, Emma, you're a massive fan of evangelism at Christmas time.
Yeah, I am a Christmas elf in human form. Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. So Easter's coming up second, which I guess makes sense as well. We've got one pancake lover in the room who enjoys Shrove Tuesday. We've got two people that think Rogation Sunday is their favourite. I'm excited about that because Rogation Sunday is one of the slightly more obscure festivals than some of the others. I'd say Lammas.
Where you live.
It depends where you live. This is true. Harvest is my favourite festival. There we go. That was just a bit of fun just to get us thinking. I'm going to stop sharing those results now.
Fantastic, thanks Holly, and thanks for getting our little grey cells warmed up. Elizabeth, you're going to take us into a Bible study to kick off our reflections. Thank you.
Yes, we're going to look at quite a familiar passage from John's Gospel, the wedding at Cana, and I think Holly's going to read that passage for us. So it's John's Gospel, chapter 2 and the first 12 verses, please.
Realise I'm unmuted. It'd be good if I unmuted myself. Okay, John 2, 1 to 12. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rite of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they remained there for a few days.
Thank you. Does anybody tell me something that really struck them from that? Every time you read a passage from the Bible, something new comes out, or it usually does. Was there anything, or are you just sitting there thinking, "Oh, what on earth has that got to do with festivals?"
For me, it was the 6 stone jars that, for some reason, when I heard that, my ears pricked up.
Right, good. That's a good thought to hold on to. Anybody else?
For me, it was reading that, it was that kind of lack of kind of dialogue between Jesus and his mother. Like, there's no kind of, he says, "What's this got to do with us?" And then she says to the people, "Just do whatever he tells you." There's no kind of explanation of that dialogue, which just struck me.
I'd love to, it's one of those conversations I'd love to have been there to see. I am convinced there was a twinkle in Jesus's eye as he said it. "I have a son that used to call me woman." And somebody heard him do that, and they thought, and they were horrified. They said, "How can you let him do that?" And I said, "Yeah, well, nobody else could get away with doing that. He does it with a big smile." So I suspect there was that sort of atmosphere. "Oh, come on, mother, I'm not ready yet. Just," and then she knows that he will, because there's that relationship between them. Yeah, despite what he says, he will get on with it. So we have what is for most of us a very familiar story. I've preached on it several times. And last year we used this as the focus for our harvest material at the Arthur Rank Centre. Because, and some people went, "That's a bit odd." But at the heart of it, there is a celebration. And it's about, there's so much in there about having a good time. And sometimes in the church, we're not necessarily good at that. We think we have to be terribly serious. But as I was reading it, the thing that sort of stuck out for me when I was preparing this was the fact that this is part of the call of some of those first disciples. The first phrase, "on the third day," as you probably know, refers to the third day after Nathanael was called as a disciple. And Jesus takes his disciples off to a wedding. And they might be thinking, "What on earth is this about?" But they go because Jesus says we must go. By the end of it, we get that nice phrase that Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So they start off going to a wedding thinking, "Don't know what we're going there for," but they come away believing in Jesus. So it's obviously a really, really special festival and commemoration. It's a visit to a wedding reception. It's a perfectly normal thing to do. And everyone in the community would have been there. They'd have all been together. And they wouldn't have gone expecting a miracle. They went because they were celebrating together as a community, as a family. And perhaps that can tell us something about what festivals are like in the church as we try and share them with our wider community. The first thing, Jesus is happy to go where he's invited. I wonder how often we sort of are a bit skeptical about going somewhere. But Jesus was happy to go where he's invited, and he doesn't take over. When he stood in the kitchen having a chat with his mum, that's not exactly taking over. She's the one that says, come on, do something about this. And this was a community event, and all would be welcome. How do we feel about that? Do we find that difficult? If we're planning a festival in the church, are we hoping that Mrs. So-and-so doesn't come because she's ever so grumpy? Or that Mr. So-and-so doesn't come because he'll be disruptive? Or are we really wanting everybody to come and feel welcome? There's no real answer to that, except we hope we're wanting everybody to come and feel welcome. And Jesus reacts to this problem. It would have been hugely mortifying for the family to have run out of wine in the middle of this wedding. They would have been seen as bad hosts. So the fact there's been this hiccup, somebody needs to do something. He doesn't just sort of nip out and get a few bottles. Whoever said 6 stone jars, and that's a heck of a lot of water. And suddenly that's transformed into the best wine, the best quality, not something that's sort of been left over. So how does that sit with our view of hospitality, I wonder? As a previous president of conference, Scott used to say quite regularly, a cup of Nescafe and a digestive doesn't cut it these days. If we're going to offer hospitality, we need to have generous hospitality. The best that we can. Doesn't necessarily have to be over the top, but the best we can. You know, good homemade cake or good homemade biscuits. A feeling that you're really there to help people, to welcome them and to make them, to give them something to feel happy about. And the other thing that comes out of this for me is Jesus was happy to work with others. He got the servants to take the jars and then take the wine out. How are we at doing that? Or do we like to be in charge? This is a church event, we're going to do it this way. Or are we happy to say, okay, how can we work on this together with a group from the community? That might be another church, but in a small community, it might well be the WI or the bell ringers or the whatever small group. Are we prepared to work with partners? And how do we feel about that? And also, if we're going to somebody else's event, how do we feel about being the church as guest? That means you have to fit in. In my first appointment, we had a large steam rally weekend in July. And before I came to the town, there had been a service at 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, because it fitted in with the church timetable. And at 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, everybody was trying to pack up and go home. So in the end, they asked the church not to come anymore. But my colleague in the parish church and I sat down and said, this is ridiculous. Well, see if they'll have us at 10 when they would like us. And this one, if you come at 10 o'clock, that would be fine. So we changed the times of our services and went to the steam fair at 10 o'clock so that people could join us. And it was on their terms. And I think that can be very important. So does anybody, I realise that's rather quick, but does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, do feel free to unmute, folks. We can be quite informal tonight because there's a relatively small group of us. So unmute if you've got any questions for Elizabeth.
I don't have a question as such, but I do have a comment. In terms of where you're talking about the scene fair, I mean, we've been and got involved with the local arts festival, and part of it is building up the trust.
Yeah.
So people know you're there on terms that fit with them. And for us, it was actually, the issue was getting evangelism and what we were putting in our goodie bags to the right state. I mean, we'd done it so there was spiritual giveaways there, but the line was we had to tell the local Catholic group church who wanted to give Bibles, actually that was overstepping the line we'd arranged with the organisers, and would be the wrong side of things. So I just really want to back up what you're saying about we are guests with other people.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sally. That's a really helpful example. Any other comments or questions?
I like the idea about the I've not heard the Nescafe and the biscuit not being enough anymore, but I kind of like that idea of generous giving. So one of the festivals that we did was our church's anniversary, especially when it was a big one. It was 150th 2 years ago. So we organised a big weekend in my local church, and that was really interesting. But we're in our community, our church is seen as the driver of a lot of those community events with the parish council, because I live in a semi-rural community, and so it's interesting. You get a reputation then. If you want to host a big event, you come to the Methodists and work to get. So it's that place in our community. Maybe it's easier to do that in a semi-rural community rather than a town. But it is really interesting, and where your place is within that, and just like Sally was saying about knowing the boundaries.
Yep, absolutely. What
is expected, what isn't expected, but you can build a good relationship, I think, with that.
Absolutely, and it takes time.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth.
If that's okay, Emma.
Check the gallery view to see if anyone else is wanting to jump in. Feel free.
I suppose I was just reflecting on the I suppose the thing of the wedding as being not a seasonal festival, but actually not kind of popped out of the blue, but an ad hoc and a one-off, and wonder how good we are at responding to, I suppose, kind of the need for more spontaneous festivals or things which kind of sometimes there's that sense that something rises up in a community or in the mood of the nation, and that how do we respond to that if it wasn't in our planning 6 months ago?
I think it depends on the relationships you have with your community, that they would come and talk to you, or you can go and talk to them about it. And again, it doesn't always have to be everything done to the last letter. It's the spirit that you do it in as well that's so important. You know, oh yes, we'd love to join you in this. What can we do to help? And going back to weddings, I mean, churches host weddings, baptisms, funerals all the time. And again, I mean, there's a whole other conversation that you could have about how we engage with those and how we meet the people for whom they're very important. And how we make a baptism service completely about that family, that baby, and make the family feel welcome, and how we pray for them and how we pray for the wedding couples, all those sorts of things. I can always do one on that as well.
I preached on the wedding at Cana at the last wedding that I led, which was an absolute joy. And it's such a fabulous story. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for giving us some reflections there. I'm going to move us on slightly, and we're going to hear from Elizabeth again in just a few minutes. We wanted to share a couple of stories. We wanted to kind of ground this in practical examples. So I'm going to talk a bit about Lee Lights. So I live in Leigh-on-Sea, which is in the borough of Southend, and the Lee Lights is the turning on of the Christmas lights in Leigh-on-Sea, and it's a big And Leigh-on-Sea is not massive. It's kind of it's a suburban area. It's got a bit of a small town feel to it, even though it's part of a bigger borough. And the turning on of the Christmas lights is a big deal. And so we, there's a big procession through the high street, and there are lots of different community groups that will have kind of what do you call it, like floats as part of the procession, or take part in this procession. And the procession route goes right past the church garden. So the church that I'm a part of has a garden that opens right out onto the route. And a few years ago, they changed the route so that it used to finish at the church, and then they swapped the route around, and now it starts quite near the church. So long before I became a minister at the church, they used to do something creative in the church garden on that evening. So it's usually the last Friday in November, and the procession, I think, is about around 6 p.m. So lots of shops will stay open beyond their normal closing time. Lots of places will be doing things like hot dogs and hot chestnuts and so on, and doing not usually free food, but kind of offering kind of street food. But actually, the church garden became one of people's favourite things to come to, that we were told, which was really, really lovely. So we've done various different things over the years, but we always kind of tried to create something that allowed people to have a spiritual moment. And we wanted to share our faith. And it was a real gift, because the parade route ran straight past the church garden. People were out on the streets, feeling, in the Christmas spirit. So it's an amazing gift. And so each year I would get together with the community worker from our church, and I was kind of the evangelist type person. And we would kind of brainstorm ideas, how can we tell the Christmas story in a new way? How can we create this space that is really beautiful, that enables people to engage with the spiritual in whatever way makes sense to them? And what story can we tell through it? So we've done various different things over the years. So one year we used A Christmas Carol, the story of Scrooge, and we had different kind of areas of the garden. Along one side of the garden, we had this like Victorian street scene, and a couple in our church who are very artistic kind of drew this street scene, and we got it printed onto these massive boards, and kind of used the story of A Christmas Carol to talk about faith. And we had this really interesting moment where I was talking with our community worker, and I was saying, how do we talk about Jesus using A Christmas Carol? Because A Christmas Carol doesn't talk explicitly much about Jesus at all. And I suddenly had this light bulb moment where I thought, the good news in A Christmas Carol is Christmas. So at the end of the story, Scrooge says, I will keep Christmas in my heart and observe it all year round, or something like that. And I suddenly realized the way in which good news, the gospel, kind of this life in all its fullness that Christ offers, is expressed in A Christmas Carol is Christmas. So anyway, that we use very quotes in the garden. Another year, we use this 4 kinds of Christmas, which is an approach. I call it an approach. It's kind of a concept that an evangelist called Glenn Scrivener came up with. And anyone who wants to know more about it, I'll put a link in the chat in a moment. And we set out these 4 kind of areas in the church garden, where we had kind of a Santa Christmas with a massive light up inflatable Santa. We had a Scrooge Christmas, again, a bit of Scrooge in there, which was kind of much more dour and kind of, we had the Scrooge armchair and a quote from the story and so on. I think my colleague Steve managed to get a sound of a clock donging in a very solemn manner. We had a shopper Christmas, so we had a shopping trolley full of kind of wrapped presents, and then we had the stable, and we kind of had a wooden stable, and we made it look beautiful. And so we've done various things over the years, and the center of it is always the Christmas tree. And we have this massive Christmas tree donated every year. And we discovered kind of by accident, when giving people kind of these tags, these kind of look like gift tags, and giving people the opportunity to write something on the tag and take it away. Instead, we found that people were hanging them on the tree. So it kind of ended up almost by accident becoming this moment that, like a moment of prayer, perhaps. In some people's minds, it was prayer. Some people may not have thought about it that way, but where people could write a thought or a wish or a hope for Christmas and hang it on the tree, and it became quite special for them. I'm just going to share a very short video. I'm going to try sharing it through screen share. Usually YouTube doesn't work great that way, but this video doesn't have any talking on it. It's just literally someone's walked through Leigh-on-Sea during Lee Lights 2 years ago and just filming it with a phone. So it kind of will give you an impression of the atmosphere. And I've moved it to 13 minutes in. So you'll see the church garden of the Baptist church, which is the one I was talking about. And then you'll see the Catholic church, which is literally opposite. And you get a very different kind of feel. And both, I think, are really beautiful. So we'll just watch that for a few minutes, just 2.5 minutes. Is that sound working? No, sorry, apologies. Best laid plans and all that. Let me try again and I'll share my computer sound this time. Okay.
These are the Verbo holiday homes waiting for you to fill with your company. Your Together away.
There we go. That was really serendipitous finding that video because I'm always involved in the Baptist church on the night of Lee Lights. I never get to see what the Catholic church is doing. And wasn't it interesting how there's two very, very different ways of engaging the community? You know, the Baptist space. Sorry, that's YouTube playing up again. Stop it, YouTube. Shh. Sorry, folks. I love the fact that you can see two different churches doing community engagement in two different ways, but in both cases, kind of taking it, you know, joining in with something that the whole town was doing and creating a space that they welcome people into that felt in ways that felt very natural. So the Catholic space, very calm, very quiet, candles being lit, very serene kind of feel. The Baptist church garden, complete chaos, very joyful, very creative. Just before we move on, Elizabeth, you had a story from a rural setting. You were telling me about the Great Yorkshire Show. Have I got that right?
Yeah, The Great Yorkshire Show happens for 3 days in July, and the churches have a stand there and they put some sort of interactive exhibition on, and they usually get sort of about 3,000 people over those 3 days. And I was manic. They always have a prayer pool at the end of it, and I was stood next to the prayer pool, and this man came in that could have looked very out of place, but he was just walking around quietly, and he came to the prayer pool, and I said, "Would you like a card?" "No, thanks, dear, I'll just sit." And he sat there for a minute, and he said, "She will hear me, won't she?" And I said, "Who?" And he said, "My mum. I need to talk to her again." And so he sat and chatted to his mum, and I'm firmly convinced God, and I prayed quietly for him. And as he left, he said, "Oh, I just want to thank everybody for making me feel so welcome." And it was such a small thing, but it obviously was huge to him.
Thank you so much. So creating that opportunity for him to connect with his mum and with God, at an event which was not run by the church. There was just the Great Yorkshire Show sounds like it's pretty massive. You know, joining was something that was a big part of the community people wanted to go to, and then offering that spiritual space.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Elizabeth, you are now going to talk to us a bit about the cycle of the liturgical year, and you're going to tell us what things like Plough Sunday are. So,
oh, I will.
Thanks very much.
We all love to celebrate, don't we? People inside and outside the church, we celebrate birthdays, anniversaries of all kinds, and the church has a huge number of opportunities to celebrate. We know that there's a real rhythm to the church year. September, in Methodism, everything begins again. We have Remembrance Sunday, Harvest Festival, then Remembrance Sunday, then Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, Pentecost. But it wasn't until I moved to a rural community that I began to appreciate some of the other rhythms. It's much easier to experience the seasons in Yorkshire than it ever was in the middle of London. In the countryside, you feel the changing seasons. You feel the days getting longer or shorter, the temperature starting to change. And also you feel the rhythm of the farming year. You can see that. You see the seeds being sown. You see the lambs being born. You see the crops starting to grow in the field. And there are all sorts of things that the communities are aware of and can become points of celebration. Going to the farming year, behind that are a whole set of medieval agricultural festivals, such as Plough Sunday, Rogation and Lammas. Why is any of that important for the church today? Now, this is our yearly cycle, and I'll go through it in more detail presently, but you'll see there, if you look at the red numbers, September's school opens, then you've got harvest, then you go through to All Saints, Christmas, Advent, Plough Sunday, Candlemas, Lent, Easter, Rogation and Lammas. So that gives you 9-10 things that you can celebrate in your community without thinking about anything else. Opportunities to engage. In rural areas particularly, the boundaries between church and community can be quite flexible, and people express their belonging in different ways. That's why Back to Church Sunday didn't always take off very well in rural areas, because asking people back to church who never felt they'd left it was always going to be a hiding to nothing. And research conducted by the Bishop David Walker looked at how people belong. And it says, certainly in rural areas, that people belong in 4 different ways. They belong through place. They might have a strong affinity to where they live and to the church building. They belong through relationships. They belong through activities, and those tend to be the people that are in church who can be quite activist, and they belong through events. And he also points out, because he did this as a proper survey with all the statistics behind it, that none of that is necessarily superficial. It can be a real entry into faith for many people. And those people who belong by events, they want to be part of the church, but they don't want to go every Sunday. but they're quite happy to come for specials. So just have a few more. Now, festivals are important ways of expressing belonging to the church. And for those further away from the church, festivals can be a way of connecting for the first time. And we need to really celebrate. Let's have some fun. We need to face outward. They don't have to be planned around what the church just what the church congregation needs. Let's think about what the community might feel comfortable with joining in. Let them be celebrations of God's abundance, just like the wedding at Cana. Let's capture some of that extravagance and grace of God. They need to be different in some ways from normal worship, and they will take time to prepare for, and they will take effort. So it's better to do a few well rather than overstretch yourself. To do any of this, you need to know your community. Who lives there? What do they already do? What day and time would work? If you're in a village with lots of commuters, then chances are 5 o'clock's not going to be a good time. But Saturday tea time might. What's going to be a good time for your people? Can you work with another church in the area? Can you get some help from the wider circuit so that if you're a small church, 1 or 2 people could be borrowed from somewhere else just to help out on the day or with the planning? Use different ways of advertising so that different generations, different people will pick it up. So let's have a look back at this circle and see some of the things. Now, harvest, September, October, depends which part of the country or church celebrates that. Can you do that outside? Can you go and celebrate harvest in a barn if you're in the countryside, or in a field? Even if you're in the city, can you bring some of the countryside in? Can you think about what farming is? Can you get a farmer to come and talk to you? As you go through to Advent, perhaps you might use Posada figures. I've used them in 2 different communities where instead of going through in people's houses from the church, they've gone into all the community buildings. And then we took photos of them in the community buildings and used those photos in Christmas services as a way of praying for the community. And if you start off in the school, then the kids are looking for them. Oh, look, Mum, there's Mary and Joseph. Oh, it must be coming up to Christmas. You can have those sort of conversations. And then January, first of the medieval services, Plough Sunday. That was the day, it's Plough Monday more properly in medieval times, was the day after the 12 days of Christmas when people went back to work. So they celebrated that. The plough was often stored in the church, so they would decorate it and take it around the community to collect money for the plough light, which was a candle that was lit and kept going in the church to remind people to pray for the land and those who work on it. Now, if you live in a city, you might think, well, what's that all about? But actually, we do all depend on farming because we eat. So there's no reason why you can't, at that time of year, have a service for people going back to work and remember farmers as part of it. Although you go through that, you'll be familiar with Lent, Easter, have your ways of doing that. But let's think about Rogation. Rogation Sunday comes before Pentecost. It's coming up soon, 4th of May this year. No, sorry, earlier than that. 7th of May is Pentecost Sunday. Rogation Sunday. Rogation comes from the word to ask, and it's about asking God's blessing. In a rural community, that's asking God's blessing because the crops are coming through. They're at that crucial point where you want, you know that things could go right or wrong. So it's about asking God's blessing on the crop, but also ask God's blessing on the wider community. Go for a prayer walk, have a picnic, get together. People find it easier to walk, perhaps to get together and walk around their community than come and sit in a building. They can talk to whoever they want to. If you stop and pray at different places, they can join in a way they feel comfortable. And the other one that you won't possibly have heard of is Lammas, which is the 1st of August. And that's when the first fruits in medieval times, the first fruits were harvested. For many of our farmers now, it's towards the end of harvest. But it's about giving thanks to God that food is coming and that people will eat, and praying for the farmers as they get that crop in, so that last minute things don't come and spoil it. And they may not be much use to you, those 3 festivals, if you're in the city, but there's ways to make so much more of the other festivals we celebrate. Easter and Christmas are so visual, and I think sometimes we forget that because we're familiar with it, but actually they're very dramatic stories. There must be ways of sharing them with others. The medieval mystery plays worked because they went out into the streets where people were. Perhaps that's something we need to rethink again ourselves. And this pattern here gives you a sense of direction in the year. It enables folk to join in at different times. And it's good that if you perhaps have people to, I don't know, an Advent message church, you might already have the publicity ready for your plough service so that you can tell them what the next thing is going to be. So I probably will pause at that point for any questions. Sally, yes, irrigation is also about beating the bounds, because in days gone by, where your boundary stones were was very important. So they used to take people, the younger people, around to make sure they knew where they were, so they knew where the boundaries of their community were.
Do feel free to unmute if you have any questions for Elizabeth. It's fascinating, Elizabeth, to hear about that rhythm of the year, and it reminds me of a long time ago when I did a gap year in Japan, and I felt very much in Japanese culture there was this real attunement to the year. Now I'm not sure if the seasons were clear in Japan. I'm not sure the climate is so different from the UK, but certainly Japanese culture is very attuned, and so things like cherry blossom viewing in May was a big thing, and they'd have cherry blossom parties. And then in autumn, it was all about the certain fruits that were only available at that time. And so certainly the supermarkets, it felt very seasonal. So fascinating to hear that. Thank you so much. Any comments or questions for Elizabeth?
I don't think it's a real festival, but a lot locally, a lot of places do scarecrow kind of competitions. So getting the church involved in building scarecrows can be, and a John Wesley scarecrow can be quite scary. So that, as a future, I'm sorry, probably offended quite a few people. But yeah, it's fine. I agree. It's always about finding the rhythm of your community.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so joining in with that as much as possible in fun ways. I was also thinking one of the ones you didn't have on your diagram thing, which we've used a bit, is fireworks night still. Yeah. As another way, it's difficult to hold a fireworks, in your garden or whatever. So can we do something around that?
Yeah.
So I think it's always about finding out rhythm in a place. So
there's something in the as well as in there about, as well as the rhythm of your place, about the consistency. Because I guess kind of Emma, you kind of spoke about the Lee lights, and I suppose part of the appeal and the impact of these types of things is actually that they become things that lay down childhood memories, and sort of people build their calendars and their knowing of what time of year it is and things around kind of those things. So actually, if you want to make a thing of Irrigation Sunday or whatever it may be in your community, presumably there's something about finding the thing that's missing and doing that, knowing you'll need to do that year in, year out for it to become a thing which kind of engages.
It takes time. It really does. And in the countryside, it can feel as if nothing's happening, but suddenly it's a tradition. I created a tradition in 3 weeks once.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Elizabeth. We're going to move into breakouts now, just for 10 minutes. Actually, we might give you 12. We might be a bit calm. We're running slightly behind tonight, but it's really not a problem. We can be relaxed tonight. So 12 minutes in breakouts. And the question is, what ideas do you have for engaging with your community through festivals? And perhaps we can challenge you to think beyond, not to focus on things you've done for ages or ideas you already had, but perhaps new possibilities that might be occurring to you from what has been shared so far. Perhaps a festival that you already celebrate, but thinking about a new way that your church might be able to engage with in the way your community celebrates it, or perhaps a festival that you haven't thought about using in your community outreach before. So I'm going to open breakout rooms. We'll be in fairly small rooms. So let me create 4 rooms. We're going to have 12 minutes. So the question is, what are your ideas for engaging with your community, and perhaps focusing on festivals you haven't thought about or ways of engaging that you haven't thought about? And we'll see you in 12 minutes. Well, welcome back, folks. I hope you had some great conversations. Love to hear some of your thoughts, some of your feedback, the things you talked about in groups. So if you prefer not to speak out loud, that's absolutely fine. You can use the chat, Zoom chat, just type your thoughts and comments. But if anyone's happy to unmute and share publicly, then please go ahead and do that.
To go first if nobody else wants to jump in.
Go for it.
We talked about a variety of different things, and actually what the pandemic has taught us in terms of how we engage with the festivals. And one of the things in my role within the district that I'm employed in is to look at ways that we can encourage churches to continue to use the outside of their buildings to recognise festivals, as they have done for the last 15 months, rather than rush back to the chock-a-block calendar of events and services are back-to-back and all of that we've done for so many years. And I think, again, I shared, our church has always done a walk of witness on Good Friday, which has been very evangelistic, very preachy, really not my comfort zone in terms of a method of evangelism, but have respectfully taken part. But because last year we couldn't do that, 2 members of our church live on the same street, so did they singing the hymns on the street, and that's formed an entire church that meet every week. There's people who've requested Bibles, and that's continued to happen because they couldn't do the walk of witness. And so part of me is also of the viewpoint that sometimes not doing the stuff we've always done just because we've always done it is a great opportunity to see new things. But we also talked about the importance of our buildings for lots of the community. So as much as doing the stuff outside to let people know we're celebrating, but then also how we create welcome. And we talked about a sense of a low threshold, it being accessible to all and welcoming to all. And some of the ways we do that is in the doing of stuff rather than in the being. So we talked about the making of bread and getting involved in activities, and that's the space in which people can feel comfortable to then talk, because the hands are busy and the mouth can kind of rattle away easily. And the other thing which I really love, because we've got some rural circuits in our district, was how do you do an Advent wreath on the outside of your church? And Edith shared a great example in a very rural context of a tractor tire with bits of drain pipe for the candles. So
wow.
we now go and recommend that to all of our rural circuits to grab as many tractor tires as possible, so we can have some Advent wreaths on our churches that are made out of rural kind of things. So that was some of our conversation, really exciting and interesting.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing, David. Lots of interesting insights there.
I think one of the challenges that we've got is to be outside more now, isn't it, rather than go back into church. That's a real challenge to us, isn't it, to be outside and not to hide back in church.
Not all churches have got a lot of room outside, have they?
No, we haven't. No, we haven't. But we used to have a lunch once a month in church, and there was a few of us, you know. We're only in a very small village, and there was about 15, 20 met in church. When lockdown started, the chap who, the local cafe owner, whatever he is, that made our lunch for us, he suggested that he could come up every week and do a takeaway lunch outside the church, and that is carried on every week. I think we missed 2 weeks, Christmas and New Year, and we've had up to 30 people coming for lunches outside the church. People who, as far as I know, they haven't been in the church, and they probably never, you know, I don't expect, well, it will be very nice but and people say, no, when you're going to go back in church to have your lunches, and I don't think, it'll be two separate things. I think we might go back in and have a lunch, but it'll be separate to the outside lunches. And so I think it's a real challenge to keep up with what we've been doing outside and not tend to go and hide back in church. One of our gentlemen is coming up, is 90 in June, and he came to our first lunch when we started it 12, 15 years ago, and I'm hoping we'll be able to have a picnic outside when it's his birthday, because we'll probably not be back in church, but we've got to be quite imaginative, I think, and it's not really one of my fortes, but I think we've got to.
Sounds like I don't know. You were the one that told us about the tractor tyre.
Oh no, it wasn't my idea. I'm pinching that one from somebody else.
All the best ideas are plagiarised.
Absolutely, 100% agree. Thank you, David, for taking the lead by using the chat. Again, for those who perhaps are a bit shy or prefer not to speak publicly, do feel free to use the Zoom chat. David says, other thing I've been reflecting on is how can we as a church engage with the festivals our community celebrate, or engage authentically. Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, Halloween, etc. Now, I could go off on a whole tangent. I won't, Holly and Elizabeth, don't worry, about Halloween. I have very strong opinions about it and the possibilities for engagement there. But Mother's Day and Father's Day actually really. So Holly, go for it.
Yeah, sorry. I've heard this idea that I basically repeat in every webinar, which I love, which is on Mother's Day and Father's Day to go to your local cemetery and serve hot drinks, because it's a day when so many people obviously visit graves. And I just think that's such a lovely way to be the church, to be a blessing on those days. So again, not my idea, plagiarised from someone else, but I think it's a fantastic idea.
Yeah, clearly spirit inspired, because I was literally about to say the exact same thing.
Really?
Yeah. Amazing idea, so simple and incredibly powerful. Joanne says, this year we did an event called More Love, using some resources from Muddy Church. Oh, I love that name. We asked the community to decorate the window and do small acts of kindness for each other. As a church, we gave out love hearts, chocolates to people. Sounds fabulous. Muddy Church, what a great idea. And it sounds as if you're in a rural community, Joanne, so clearly very contextually appropriate. I'm going to move us on, if that's okay, because we're due to finish in just under 25 minutes, and we definitely want to hear from Holly tonight, our Evangelism and Contemporary Culture Officer, who's going to be talking with us about doing evangelism through so we've talked a lot about community engagement, Holly, and giving stuff out and making people feel welcome. So you're going to help us think specifically about evangelism.
Yes, I am. So I'm going to help us think a bit about how we share our faith through these festivals. And to do that, I'm going to share my screen to start with. I hope this works. There we go. So I just want to talk about kind of three, you can all see that, can't you? That's good, you can see my slides, great. I want to talk about kind of three key ingredients for sharing our faith through these festivals, through events in the community, and they are story, relationship and risk. If any of you are from Yorkshire West District and were at the Synod on Saturday, you might recognise some of this, as I did a similar presentation then, but this is specifically for liturgical festivals and Christian events. So let's start by thinking about story. I think this is the first key ingredient that I want to look at in sharing our faith confidently is story. So our Christian festivals, as we've already talked about this evening, are rich in their stories, and they're stories that our communities do know fairly well, with some festivals better than others, and they don't always completely accurately know the stories of our Christian festivals, but festivals like Christmas, Easter, even festivals like Harvest are events that are embedded culturally in our communities. So they're good moments for sharing the stories. And I think sharing our faith always begins with story. So we're called to share God's story, not in a vague or kind of theoretical way, but in a compelling way, and in a way which also communicates something of our own story, our testimony. By testimony, I don't necessarily mean the story of how you came to faith, although it could be this. I mean, more broadly, our testimony, our story, is simply saying the difference God's story makes in our own life. And I think this is the best starting point in sharing our faith in evangelism, is our testimony, our own lived experience of God's love. In testimony, we speak of what we know to be true. We speak of the goodness of God we have seen around us. And this, I think, in evangelism is more powerful than kind of a theological argument. It means you don't need to know the answers to people's questions always, but you can say at Christmas, this is why the birth of Jesus makes a difference in my life. Or at Easter, this is why the resurrection matters to me. Or at Harvest, I can see God's provision in my own life in these ways. So when we're planning our outreach initiatives through the liturgical year, we need to consider, how are we creatively sharing God's story, and how are we sharing our own stories of God in our lives? And I love, some of the examples we've had today about the creative ways that we've shared stories. We don't always need to use words to share stories. We can do this in various creative ways. But I would suggest that any initiative we plan should also incorporate opportunities to actually speak to people in our communities about our faith. Sharing our faith through actions is powerful and important, we know this. But the Talking Jesus research from 2015 tells us that for people who didn't grow up in a church, in a Christian family, having a conversation with a Christian was the most significant influence in them finding faith. So if we're embarking on evangelism and sharing our faith, the most significant thing we can do is have a conversation. And we see this in the Gospels as well. Jesus shows people God's love through his actions, but this doesn't mean that his words are unnecessary, and quite the opposite. Jesus's words in the Gospels are often a significant commentary on his actions, helping his companions and his contemporaries understand what the signs of his ministry meant. So while we are called to live out our faith in deed, we're also called to speak of our faith. Word and deed and prayer are equal partners in our mission and outreach. But speaking of our faith is, of course, a bit intimidating for some of us, for many of us. And we may not feel like we have gifts for speaking of our faith. We may not feel confident in evangelism, but story is the place to start. Saying truthfully what God is doing in your life is always the starting point. And the stories of our Christian festivals give us a framework for shaping our testimonies. So in our planning, we should ask ourselves those questions. What's the story of God we tell through this festival? How does this story relate to my own story of God in my life, to my real experience of God? But also, how can we invite others into that story? I loved Emma's example that she shared about Lee Lights, and how physically walking through the story of Christmas past a stable into an experience of prayer or an experience of spirituality. How can we invite others into the stories that these festivals are all about? I think just to give an example of the ways that we might kind of share testimony through our festivals. For example, if you've got a carol, if you're having a carol service, or if you're having some kind of Christmas event, as well as the usual Christmas scriptures that narrate the story of Jesus's birth, we could consider, what's the good news in this particular narrative that our community needs today? We've talked a lot already about kind of listening to our community, doing stuff that's appropriate for our community, contextually appropriate, sensitive. But just spending some time thinking about that in your planning. What is the good news in this particular festival that my community needs to hear? So, for example, at Christmas, is it that God came to earth as a vulnerable baby, and therefore God meets us in our vulnerability? Is it the Christmas message of Emmanuel, that God is with us? is it that Jesus was born into displacement and marginalization and comes to proclaim freedom for the oppressed? It could be, obviously it could be all these things, but narrowing down into one particular expression of the good news in that particular story. So rather than just sharing the narrative that our communities are familiar with, Jesus was born in a stable, but drawing out the particular good news story which will shine a significant new light on that festival for our communities. We can do that through art, through video, through sermons, through children's ministry, through things outside our churches. But also, how can we relate this to our own testimonies, to our own stories? Can we invite others to share their stories, their testimonies? So could we ask someone to share a poem or a video on social media about the difference that this particular story of God has made in their life? So that's story. And moving on to relationship. And I think this is the second key ingredient in evangelism that I want to talk about. Jesus didn't have a one-size-fits-all message, fits-all good news message for the people he met. He entered into authentic relationship with others. He talked to them, he ate with them, he journeyed with them, he lived life alongside them. So Jesus shows us that real relationship involves listening and seeing the other person, and it usually involves vulnerability. It involves living alongside people in community, and it involves giving and receiving, not just one-sided provision. And so in the work we do as the church, in our initiatives at festival times and throughout the year, our most effective initiatives will be the ones which build authentic mutual relationships. And so in our planning for our liturgical festivals, we should prioritise relationship building. So, for example, instead of doing something that's a one-off, could we do a series of events in the same place? We've talked a bit about this already. Neil talked about consistency. How can we show up in a regular way in our communities? How can we encourage conversation? How can we encourage really actually getting to know people rather than just a kind of hit and run mission event? So, for example, over the season of harvest, could we put a small pop-up gazebo in the village green or in the middle of an estate or in the town centre or somewhere where people pass by? Gets us out of our kind of church buildings, away from our church buildings. We could offer activities, we could offer hot drinks, we could offer a space for prayer and conversation, and we could talk about the provision of God over harvest time. And if we're there for a solid amount of time, people will drift back and get to know us. It's like a pop-up church in the middle of community, serving our communities for a season. And as we've already talked about, making things a tradition. So people expect us to be there. People know that we're committed to the community that we serve and that we're a part of. And evangelism does demand that we show up in our community in a regular way, that we're there in relationship with people, that we're visible to our community. We're there in the middle of these communities, listening and being with one another. And festivals give us a chance to do this in a really creative way, in an intentional way for a certain season, so that we're not kind of trying to show up every kind of Sunday for the whole year, exhausting ourselves, but we've got a set season that we dedicate ourselves to a particular initiative to build those relationships in our communities. And the third thing I want to talk about is risk. Sharing our faith, evangelism is one of those words with a lot of baggage. The idea of evangelism can feel risky and uncomfortable. It does for everybody. I think there are a few people who are fearless when it comes to evangelism, but that is not very many of us. And I don't think you wake up one day as an evangelist and find that your fear about talking about your faith has suddenly gone away. For most of us, talking about our faith feels vulnerable and scary, and we lack confidence. But just because it feels risky doesn't mean that we're not called to share our faith. God calls us out of our comfort zones. I've used a verse on this slide from Genesis about Abraham. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. But I could have used kind of any number of verses from the Bible where God calls people into places that are risky and uncomfortable. I could have used the calling of the disciples or any number of verses. But in those places where God calls us, God doesn't leave us on our own. God meets us and grows us for the task. The times we step out of our comfort zones are often times we lean most on God and learn something new about God and ourselves. And so it is that sharing our faith deepens our faith. So we can't wait until the day where we feel 100% confident before we take the risk, because it probably won't ever arrive. But in the process of taking that risk, we meet God, we participate in God's work, and we grow in our faith. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is, how can we get beyond just kind of slightly fluffy, creative evangelism? This stuff is great for sharing our stories, for sharing the story of God, but how can we really follow God where God calls us into those risky, uncomfortable places and have vulnerable conversations with the people in our communities? So in our planning for festivals, for outreach, we should think about the ways we can take some risks. Many of our projects are creative and beautiful, but how can we fully, radically communicate the good news of God? So for example, at Lent and Easter, we might decide to paint some pebbles and leave them around our community for people to find, sharing messages of hope and resurrection. This is a fabulous project, a way of communicating good news messages, and people can find them. It's beautiful, it's creative, it's of God. But how can we also push it a little bit further and take some risks? Could we write a web link on the back of the pebbles, and on that web address, share a video of our testimony, of our Easter story and why it matters to us? Could we invite people for comments? Could we invite people to an event? Could we invite them to sign up to an Alpha course if they'd like to explore it further, or come along to something that's about exploring faith, or even just come along to an event where we will serve them tea and coffee or be served? So just thinking about the ways we can take our evangelism a step further, sharing our stories, leading people into community and into exploring. So it's not just about kind of a one-way thing, but it's about putting ourselves out there in a vulnerable way as well and leaning on God's provision. In our evangelism, one of our greatest failures is forgetting that God is already at work in people's lives in the world. We sometimes think it all depends on our own activity. But if we wish to be authentic, confident sharers of our faith, then we must take some risks and learn to depend on God's presence and power. So when we're planning for our festivals, we should consider story. How are we creatively sharing God's story? How are we sharing our own stories of God in our lives? And how are we inviting others into God's story? Relationship, we should prioritize initiatives which allow us to really connect with others and journey with them in community. And risk, let's not be risk averse as we listen for God's call, as we do our planning and our discerning. Sharing our faith deepens our faith. Following God into the unknown allows us to depend on God's presence and power. So that's my little run through of my 3 key ingredients for evangelism. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Evangelism through festivals. Any questions, any comments, any thoughts? It was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Apologies about that.
That was amazing. Thanks, Holly. Again, feel free to unmute or to put your questions in the Zoom chat, folks. And I'm going to try and avoid the extrovert temptation to move on too quickly before other people have had a chance to think. So let's just hold some quiet and allow people time to formulate some questions. Holly, I love what you said about risk. I'm just thinking about some of the the many different ideas that have been shared tonight and what risk might look like.
Even if it's just making space for a conversation, I think that could be the riskiest thing we can do sometimes.
I think it is a real reminder of the importance of not chasing numbers. Just trying to think of kind of, we used to do the big lunch at a church I was involved in, and the years when we had 200 people it was fantastic and the place was rammed and it was really exciting. But actually, the year that it dropped down to about 100, actually it was better because there was less running around and more chance to talk to people you hadn't met before.
I think that's a really good point, Neil, about numbers, but also about kind of frenetic activity. I think so often when we run events, or, you know, especially things like at Christmas time when people in ministry are just doing so much, how can we protect space to just sit and talk to people that we're with, that we're with in community with, and you know, a lot of our outreach projects don't create that protected space. They're about kind of provision, or they're about serving people, or they're about doing rather than just getting to know people. That's what evangelism is all about, really.
And I think with the relationship bit you were talking about, Holly, it's looking at all the stakeholders involved, because if we're collaborating with people, often we just focus on the people coming to the event, but we're likely to have more chance to build relationship with the people we're co-working with, particularly if there's ongoing meetings during the year and stuff. So I think we need to see evangelism perhaps more widely than just those who attend the event, which I know I fall into the trap of quite often.
Absolutely. So our partners, our community partners, are also all on their own journeys. And how do we invite them into an encounter, and how do we share the good news with them? And actually, I think that's a really good point, Sally, about making things we do and plan, have people on the planning committees or on the, you know, helping out, and volunteers that aren't part of the church community, makes it a much stronger event for initiative or whatever it is.
Fantastic idea.
Yeah, I agree with you, Holly. It's such a danger of being tempted to be the performer. And it is a temptation, isn't it? Because you put yourself in a position of power then.
Yeah.
And it really it undermines effectiveness, where authentic relationship.
Absolutely. I mean, I completely agree, Angie. In the Gospels, we see Jesus is always in kind of mutual relationships where, you know, there isn't a power dynamic in the same way that if we're kind of being the provider or the performer, as you've said, we have to do some of that leveling out work before we can share good news with people, because otherwise it's not kind of mutual relationship.
One of the things that I've seen happen in our circuit recently with a couple of what would have been seen and put forward as really successful community cafe initiatives was then the jeopardy of running the small number of volunteers into the ground, but it became more and more elaborate, to the point that you can get on the cusp of it failing. And then when you step back, you actually realize that the participants just want the permission to gather in somewhere that's warm and dry. Nobody's going to fuss about kids running around, and there's plenty of space for wheelchairs, and everyone's welcome. And although, I mean, I'm not an instant coffee drinker, but there's something to be said. If you up the bar all the time, you get to the point where it's just not sustainable, and forget what you're trying to achieve.
About authenticity, isn't it? And just being yourselves. And that comes back to relationship again, doesn't it?
One of these village settings, it took for the initiative to implode, and then all the community participants said, well, actually all we really wanted you to do was unlock the door. The permission giving. And they would have, and that's what's regrowing now, is a more community-led initiative.
Thank you.
We're near. It's nearly time for us to finish. That felt like it went pretty quickly. I'd love, in the last 3 minutes, and I will genuinely be quiet this time, promise. Scout's honour. I'd love for us to just take 3 minutes and ask God, what one thing might I do as a result tonight? I was about to say should, but we don't like the word should, do we? Or must. What one thing might God be inviting us to do as a result tonight? So Elizabeth's told us about some festivals that we might not even have thought about. Holly has encouraged us to think about telling our story forming relationships and taking a risk in our evangelism. And I think all of us have touched on the idea of giving away power, not feeling that we have to control everything, run everything, host everything, but actually joining in what our community is already doing. So let's just take a couple of minutes of silence. I'd like to encourage you to pop in the chat, what one thing might you do as a result tonight? Well, it's 8:30 on the nose, folks, but thank you so much to those who've just started to pop in the chat the thing that they might do as a result of tonight. So talk to our worship team about some of the festivals that have been mentioned, find out what community events already happen in the area where I live, look at how I might get involved, linking the climate change and COP26 to harvest. Fantastic, genius, absolutely. Challenge our leadership team in planning, not do just because it's a Christian festival, but to think how we can take a risk with relationships we have to go deeper and further and wider. Have some discussions about building relationships as an integral part of planning events. Folks, we are going to need to leave it there, but thank you so much for taking part. Thank you, Holly and Elizabeth, for all that you shared. Thanks to all of you for being with us. The recording will be going up on our web pages in the next couple of days, so do pass it on to folks that weren't able to be with us tonight, but you think would love to give some thought to this area. So enjoy the rest of your evening, and we hope to see you very soon.
Bye.
Bye.